Good evening, everyone in Asia. Good afternoon to everyone in Europe and Africa, and good morning to everyone joining us from the Americas. Let me thank you all for tuning in at this rather unconventional time, but we wanted to include as many continents in this conversation as possible. My name is Dini Jalal, and I am the Associate Director for Editorial at the Heinrich Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you today, including our experts who are joining us. Let me provide a bit of context about the webinar, and apologies if I'm speaking fast because we don't have that much time. Digital trade and the digital economy are a critical focus for us at the Heinrich Foundation. We are passionate about exploring solutions that ensure that digital trade benefits everyone. That includes small businesses who make up the bulk of our economies and small economies who may be struggling to keep up with the rapid developments of today's world. Today, we will discuss an evolving topic, but an important one, and that is digital sovereignty and data sovereignty. Our experts will explain in greater detail what is meant by the term. After all, sovereignty is a term that often provokes debate, if not disputes. So apply that to the digital world and complexities will surely follow. I'll try to be brief with my introductions. The full bios of our speakers are on our website. Let me begin with Deborah Elms, the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, which works with governments and companies to better prepare better trade policies. Debbie and her team have produced a series of excellent reports for the Heinrich Foundation, the latest of which focuses on digital sovereignty. We are also honored to have with us Henry Gao, law professor at Singapore Management University and a very well-known trade expert. Professor Susan Ariel Aronson of George Washington University is also here with us. Susan leads the university's Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub and is a senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. She also wrote the primer on data governance for the Heinrich Foundation. Thank you for that, Susan. Lastly, we're delighted to have with us Francisco Mingaransi, who leads CISPE, which is the Cloud Infrastructure Services Providers in Europe. Apologies for all the acronyms. Francisco is also a board member of Gaia X, a coalition of businesses, policymakers, and academics working to create a federated and secure data infrastructure. Again, thank you all. Let me just, some logistics, turn your attention to the Q&A function on your screen. You can send in your questions at any time. Please remember to keep your questions succinct and limited to one only. Please note also that this session is being recorded and that the recording will be available on our website next week. Without further ado, let me turn to Deborah Elms, who will explain the digital sovereignty paper. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. And I'm here, of course, representing in part the Asian Trade Center out of Singapore and the work that we do, but in particular discussing this paper that is part of our Heinrich Foundation series that we've been working on digital trade issues. This particular paper was actually has a co-author. So Nick Agnew, who is fabulous and one of my staff members, also worked very hard on this, the series in general, but this paper in particular. So I want to thank very much Nick for his participation. So what were we trying to do? Let me just back up slightly and just describe the series. So we've been doing a series with the Heinrich Foundation. There will be 6 papers in total. This is paper number 4. The next one coming up is on competition policy in the digital space. And the final paper, which will be out after Christmas and the New Year, will be on digital and development. So how do we get economic development using digital tools? And the point of the series from the perspective of us and the Heinrich Foundation was to start flagging issues of concern in the digital economy for development purposes, for small businesses in particular, but in general, sort of areas that we see where we have policy making going in one direction, businesses potentially going in a slightly different direction, and the net result could actually create major challenges without anyone quite realizing it. So it's these are not areas where policymakers are deliberately necessarily out to destroy the internet as we know it, but because of unintended consequences and unclear effects of different kinds of policies, you will end up with harm being done to the economy, and in particular, because of our area of focus, small businesses. So the series has looked at different areas, things like electronic payments, general problems in the digital space, this one on sovereignty, competition, development, et cetera. So we've done this series because we obviously have a lot of work on the digital space. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with some serious experts in the area who I'm really interested in hearing what they have to say. And we thought for this paper that we're working on now, digital sovereignty, we thought this is an interesting topic where the term is starting to be thrown around quite a bit, digital sovereignty or data sovereignty, without really understanding quite what that, I think, without necessarily understanding what that means. And crucially, without understanding, again, the consequences of saying that there should be sovereignty over the digital space or sovereignty over the data space. So the point of the paper and the point of all of these papers in the series is a little bit frustrating because we're not giving you solutions to the problem as much as we are saying there is a potential problem. Here are the reasons why this is a potential problem. This is the approaches that we see governments taking in different areas to address some of their concerns. And then here are some consequences that may flow from that without being able to say concretely, because it's too early really, what are the actual solutions that we would recommend. So this paper then follows that same approach. And I'm not going to go through the paper in exhaustive detail. I really encourage you to read it. But the paper then goes through, and I'll do this briefly, sort of what is digital sovereignty and why is it an issue? And then goes through some of the markets that are particular leaders in this discussion around sovereignty, including the European Union, some of the members of Southeast Asia in ASEAN, India, China. I will not go into a lot of that detail, in part because my panelists are so good and in part because we don't have a lot of time, but I recommend the paper to you for that. So let me just describe very briefly, what do we mean and why are we worried about this term digital sovereignty? I think it comes originally from a misconception about data and about information flows. And I think the real root of our challenge is whoever coined the term that data is the new oil created a series of problems for all of us. And in particular, you say, well, if data is oil or equivalent to oil or a resource that needs to be, that exists, it then requires someone to pay attention to it. And it requires you to carefully guard that resource. And in particular, to own it. And so we have this idea, if data is like oil, then many of the traditional tools of sovereignty, which is government jurisdiction over a geographic space, should apply to data or to the digital economy, just as if it were a natural resource like oil. Oil comes out of the ground. If it comes out under your territory, you own it. If it comes out under your neighbor's territory, they own it. And this concept of sort of digital plus sovereignty has created this new idea about digital sovereignty. And under digital sovereignty, the basic point is for governments that are enthusiastic about this approach, that data is valuable, that my citizen data is therefore my data and I should own it and I should be sovereign or control that data. So that's the sort of simple explanation for what this challenge is. And then what follows from that is a series of policies that you say, well, if data is important and valuable, and my citizen data is important and valuable, I need to take steps to ensure that my citizen data remains in my country in particular. So that leads you to do a number of things, including much more concerns over data privacy, data security, to make sure that your valuable citizen data is not being collected and just distributed to other states. It means that you need to be thinking harder about how to monetize often that data and make sure that you control it, to make sure that you allow domestic firms more license to have control over that data than foreign firms because of the sovereignty argument around this. And the net result is you end up with a different set of policies than you would have if you said data is not like oil. Data has value. I'm not arguing data is valueless, but it is not the same kind of resource as oil or timber or diamonds or whatever, which is data is a unique, it's unique. Data is not something that you have in the ground, and then when you decide you need it, you harvest it and it works well for you. It's about timing. You know, some data is useful, some data is less useful. It's useful in the moment when you need it. It's useful when you have the application that allows you to do something with that data. Data on its own is, you know, zeros and ones in a machine. That's not helpful. So there has to be a whole process around data. And there is a tension and a growing discussion between those who think that the digital space is fundamentally different from the non-digital space and needs to be regulated differently. And those who would say, again, sort of it's oil, it's resource, it's the same kind of thing. And then the last point that I'll make, because again, I know we're kind of crunched for time and I really want to hear questions from the audience, is the ability of governments to manage data is going to vary tremendously. So there will be some governments that if they choose to go down the digital sovereignty path, may be more successful at it because they have especially a large domestic economy that generates a fair amount of data on their own, as opposed to, like, imagine they're a tiny, you know, island state, not Singapore size, but sort of Singapore population is not tiny. So imagine you're very tiny. You're not creating a lot of data. The value of that data might not be that useful in general. So if you're a large state with a lot of domestically generated data, then you have different opportunities perhaps than if you're a small state. And if you have the ability as a government to really carefully control the movement of data across borders by requiring data to stay local, you must have servers, you must not allow data to flow offshore. That is very difficult to do because the internet as it's been built is not structured around geographically constricted bordered states. So you're trying to break basically the way the internet has worked in order for you to have control over it. If you're a large, powerful state, you may have more resources to do that if you choose to do so than if you were smaller states. And one of the points that we flagged towards the end of this paper, which I think is really, in my view, very important for development purposes, is that many of the governments that are enthusiastic about data or digital sovereignty are not actually in a position to either control their data or be sovereign over it. And in fact, the consequences of trying to do so could be really catastrophic for their economy. So one example that I would give, which is not in the paper, but I think is relevant, is a small island state who said, we want to make sure that all of our citizen financial data remains onshore. Okay, think about what that means though. This is a small island state. They do not have local data hosting capabilities. And if they did, it probably wouldn't be very safe or secure. And they only have one bank actually that is willing to participate in their economy in the first place. If you make that bank have to host all of the citizen data in country, that bank might say it's just not worth it to us. Like, this is a tiny market, we make very little money as it is. If I have to add on redundant data facilities in order to keep the data onshore, forget it, I'm out, I'm gonna leave. And then you've got this small island state that has no financial system or has no legal way, at least for banks or for citizens to participate in the financial system. This is not an isolated example. I mean, this is coming up more and more often. And so what we really wanted to do in the paper and why we wanted to have this conversation in general is to flag for governments, especially, be careful what you wish for, basically. Like, be aware of how the digital economy works, how data flow policies work. And if this is where you want to go, make sure that you are very clear-eyed about the costs and benefits of doing so and the consequences. And crucially, as with all things in trade, those costs especially will be borne most directly by the smallest companies because they do not have the capacity to say, in every market in which we might operate, we need to have separate digital sovereignty rules in place, different privacy regimes, different data hosting requirements, all kinds of different regulations are different in every market. This is a disaster if you're small. And so I think, let me just stop there because I think it sets a bit of a tone and allow my panelists to fill in around the sides of this. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak to people.
Thanks. Thanks, Deborah. I have a question later I'll pose to you. Henry, let me turn to you. You wrote a paper describing or delineating data sovereignty into 3 categories and described it as the 3 kingdoms. I'm really curious, could you explain more, please?
Yes, thank you, Dini, and thanks to the Heinrich Foundation for hosting this. It's a pleasure to join your events. So in my paper, I discussed the concept of the data sovereignty. Sovereignty is is a term that international lawyers are most familiar with. It basically refers to this idea of a highest independent power within a country that people typically associate with the government. But when we enter the digital age, we hear people talk about data sovereignty or digital sovereignty. So if you think about it, I mean, this concept of data sovereignty is kind of an oxymoron because data by its nature actually transcends border, while sovereignty is normally confined to within the borders. So what do we mean by this concept of a data sovereignty? So in my paper, I try to kind of clarify the term because I mean sovereignty, even though traditionally referred to the government, but you can explain the concept a little bit by saying that the sovereignty would rest with whoever has the control. And actually, this is the concept taken by Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig in his paper, where he discussed, for example, citizen sovereignties and merchant sovereignties. So basically, sovereignties where the citizen or the merchants would have control. And if you look at the regimes around the world as an argument, you do see that there are different sovereign models, and they each give the sovereignty to different actors in the digital realm. Because when you look at the digital trade, I mean, you can basically see that there are three types of actors. The first are the firms, big firms like Facebook, like Google, which provide these services. And the second would be consumers, the users, and also the generators of data. And the last but certainly not least would be the government, so who would have the regulatory power. So in my paper, I divided the models around the world into three different data sovereignty regime models. The first one is the US, which I call the firm sovereignty model, because in the US, you see that the US government take this kind of a laissez-faire approach to digital trade regulation, and they basically give a lot of freedom to the private firms. So you see that Facebook and Twitter and Google, they all have this power, which are similar to the concept of sovereignty, as mentioned by Professor Lessig. And then China, I would call it the state sovereignty model, because here the state is the leading actor that basically controls the data, and the state regulates not only the consumers, but also the firms. So this is what I would call a state sovereignty model. And for the EU, I would call it an individual sovereignty model, because in the EU, what you see is that, especially with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, the EU is really empowering the users, the consumers, by saying that you have control over your data, and unless you give your consent, neither the firm nor the government can touch your data. So this is what I would call the individual sovereignty model. So these three different sovereignty models also result in different approaches that they take with regard to the regulation of digital trade and data in the various international agreements. For example, if you look at the US trade agreements, you find that in many of the US trade agreements, these tend to emphasize on two provisions. The first one is a free flow of information across the border, and the second one is a prohibition of data localization requirements. And these two provisions both reflect the interests of private firms, because again, you see firms like Facebook and Google, they want their data to be able to freely flow across the world. And also they do not want to have to establish a local server in every country they operate in. While if you look at the EU, I mean, for the EU, as I mentioned, individual sovereignty model, whereby the key is protection of privacy. So you see that the EU privacy regulation, the GDPR, which basically elevate the issue of privacy protection from a consumer right, as it is the case in the US, to a level of fundamental human rights. So this is something that is really secret, that you cannot touch. And the EU also requires its trade partners, to first of all, to prove that they provide adequate levels of protection to the privacy rights of EU citizens before a data transfer is allowed between the EU and the other jurisdictions. So that is the individual sovereignty model. While for China, the state sovereignty model is reflected in the fact that in China, the cyber sovereignty is an issue that is elevated to the level of national sovereignty, and the cybersecurity is an issue that has been elevated personally by President Xi to the level of state security. So in China, as we all know, there is a strong regime of online censorship, which means that the information do not flow freely. And if you look at the privacy regulation, until very recently, China didn't have a strong privacy protection rules, but this changed just 2 days ago with the coming into force of the personal data protection law of China. But even with the PDPL coming into effect, you can still see traces of a state sovereignty in the law, in the sense that the law still left a lot of discretion to the government. Private firms trying to access personal data, there will be all these restrictions, but there are all these leeways available to the government so that the government are not subject to the same stringent requirements. So why do we have 3 different sovereignty models? I argued in the paper there is 2 reasons. The first is because they have different commercial interests. If you look at the US firms and Chinese firms and EU firms, among the top 10 digital firms in the world, e-commerce firms in the world, 6 are American firms and 4 are Chinese firms. So the American firms would be the ones like Facebook and Google, where they really sell just the digital products. They do not sell physical products. They sell social media services and so on. And of course, they would have this demand for free flow of data across the border. Firms, they sell mainly physical goods because you have firms like Alibaba, so they are not so interested in free flow of data. Instead, they are more interested in trading goods, trade facilitation provisions, which China has been negotiating in its free trade agreements. But there are no EU firms on the list because, as I said, 6 American and 4 Chinese firms. So for the EU, they are not really a major player in digital trade. So that explains the GDPR, which has been regarded by some as digital protectionism to try to fight out the spread and the evasion by American and Chinese firms in Europe by erecting such a barrier. The second reason for the difference is because of the different regulatory philosophies among the 3 jurisdictions. In the US, there has been a very strong tradition of non-regulation or self-regulation, because in the US federal law, for example, the Telecommunication Act, the explicit states that we should make sure that the internet would remain unaffected by both federal and the state regulation. While in China, there has been a history of a strong and heavy government intervention since the start of the internet in 1994, as I discussed in my other paper, data regulation with Chinese characteristics. And for the EU, you could argue that we have a strong tradition of a protection for human rights, and this is a legacy from the Second World War, where because of all these atrocities of the war, so they wanted to protect human rights. So that is reflected in the European Convention on Human Rights and also the European Code on Human Rights, and that is also reflected on data protection, privacy protection. So these 3 different models coexist, and they are also now increasingly being adopted by different countries around the world. There's a recent study by the OECD in which they actually found that actually, if you look at countries around the world, they would each fall under one of the 3 models. So it is very interesting that we have these 3 models coexisting, and I think it is even more interesting to find out whether or not they could coexist into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Okay, Susan, I know that you have a lot of concerns about data sovereignty. Go ahead, please.
Well, hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I know my presentation's not up yet. Can you guys
Yeah,
screen
there you
share?
go.
That would be great. Okay. So I want to talk about what's behind this rise in data sovereignty and why I in particular find it of concern. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm saying that it is an issue of control. As Henry said, but I see it quite differently. In the past, historically, personal data and many other types of data, whether it's satellite data, except for proprietary data, was held in general by governments. And control over various types of data has shifted from governments to firms. But policymakers, in order to achieve very important domestic policy goals, whether it's national security, human welfare, social stability, economic inequality, disinformation, they need greater control. So this imbalance is leading, in my view, to a view of data that can cause problems. Next slide, please. So reason I say it can cause problems is that data's value lies in its use and its reuse. And for all of us interested in scientific progress and democracy, data sharing is essential. You want to have a feedback loop. You want to have a culture of openness and accountability. Yet what we see is digital sovereignty or data sovereignty, the right to control, the collection, ownership, and application of data. So it's about control. But when you limit access to data, you reduce the generativity of data, and that means it can't be used, or less of it can be used, shared, and crossed, which can also have implications for the internet because that shared platform, that commons, can be undermined. Next slide, please. So data sovereignty, so which nations are claiming sovereignty over data? I would argue that it's a mix. Almost every nation has claimed some sovereignty over data, even if they say whether they're New Zealand, the most open economies in the world. Every nation has a mix of openness and control. And at the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, we map the governance of various types of data. And there is a correlation between nations that overly control data and authoritarian regimes, again, for all types of data. But what is interesting is even some democracies, when they have rules in place, they have exceptions for the government use of personal data. I put there the website. What is interesting is that, for example, the United States is widely condemned, and quite rightly, for not having a uniform set of rules governing private sector use of data. But the United States does have a lot of rules governing public sector use of personal data. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give some examples where I see data sovereignty of concern. So example one is India, where there is no personal data protection law yet, but so far the drafts of the bill say that the government will not be subject to personal data protection rules. So we'll have to see what the final legislation looks like, but it's not looking good. In the United States, in the Defense Authorization Act, under the Trump administration, the United States took greater control over, for example, foreign investment in data-rich firms. And that really worries me, and we can talk about that later if you'd like. China, you see data sovereignty for national security, social stability, and now even income inequality concerns. But here too, the government has many exceptions to personal data protection rules. So why is this of concern? Again, I say governments are taking more and more control of this for good reasons, but also it can have bad results. They are trying to counter the market and political power of the giant data firms. They're all doing it in different ways. Okay, next slide, please. So as Deborah pointed out, data governance is hard. And this has real implications for data governance at the national level and at the international level. So there are many large countries with large populations, such as India, and relatively large populations, such as South Africa, that say they want to find effective laws, strategies, and regulations, structural changes, et cetera, at home before they act internationally to govern data. Yet at the international level, the world would really be helped if we could come up with international and interoperable rules. But now let's look at those rules. And what they say is enforce your own laws for privacy, spam, and consumer protection. So that sends the message that interoperability is not a priority. Moreover, in the trade regime, whether it's governed by bilateral, regional, or hopefully at the international level, data sovereignty issues, nations generally rely on the exceptions to justify their behavior. So this is going to be tough to regulate it if you think it should be regulated. Okay, next slide, please. So in the next slide, I just want to show you what the most recent digital economy agreements or digital trade agreements say. And so every one of these agreements, and I'm not addressing whether or not they're binding and disputable, encourages the free flow of data, plus they have GATS exceptions, and they ban data localization. And then they have this message of enforce your own laws. Okay, so that's where we're at. Next slide, please. All right, I just wanted to give you a sense of where data sovereignty might be going and how the trade implications of that. So I didn't write about this in the paper that I wrote for Dini and the Hinrich Foundation, but for example, data sharing rules could be seen as violating MFN and national treatment. They could be seen as a disguised restriction on trade. And will the system deal with them? We will have to see. But right now they don't. Another example is rules governing the use of algorithms, the right to an explanation as example, which could be seen as a measure of data sovereignty, taking greater control. And again, that could have a market trade effect of violating MFN or national treatment. I don't want to go too far into this, but here are just some examples of it. Censorship and internet shutdowns are another examples of governments taking greater control over data, albeit in a much more extreme way. So for my final slide, I just want to say what this is about control. And it's about taking control again from, yes, governments control lots of data, but increasingly global firms control the bulk of personal data, and the value of data lies in its use and reuse. And if firms have this control, governments increasingly find in order to achieve their policy goals, they have to regulate. And so this is what they're doing. Thanks for hearing me out.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, Francisco, you represent Europe in this forum, at least. Is it about control?
Thank you, Dini. Thank you for the Heinrich Foundation for inviting me on this panel. So I'll come to your question in a minute because I talk a lot about control. So you can perhaps judge by yourself. So today I'm here speaking in my capacity of Secretary General for CISPE.cloud, CISPE standing for Cloud Infrastructure Service Providers in Europe. It's a trade nonprofit organization, and we represent cloud and data infrastructure provider. So to refer to Deborah's reference to data being the oil, the companies I work with are rather the rigs and the pipes that allow us to extract and exploit that oil. So we are really the underlying infrastructure level, not the Facebooks or the or the from the user facing. And what I would like to do is to share a few highlight and insights based on my involvement in CISPE, but also in Gaia-X, and also with ideas from the sector I represent. I will offer a short EU background. I do not pretend to represent the EU, but at least I give you a few hints, and maybe share 5 of the attributes that that we believe as CISPE are characteristic of data and digital sovereignty. So first, at the EU level, in a recent State of the Union speech by European Commission President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, there is a clear drive and commitment to secure Europe digital sovereignty based on the EU goals. And in this context, digital sovereignty refers to Europe's ability to control and to exert control over its computing power, data, and secure connectivity infrastructure. So this is for the EU background. In terms of attribute to data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, we have identified the following 5 characteristics. First is technological freedom of choice. The second one is control over personal data, which will echo a little bit what Henry was saying. Security and resilience. The fourth one is the protection of legal interest and jurisdictional immunity. This is also a very hotly debated topic. And the last one, which might not seem obvious, is sustainability of data and cloud infrastructure. So these are attributes that we have identified as a trade group. And I will offer you a quick item overview on each of them, and maybe with some recommendation that we are promoting as a trade organization. So on freedom of technology, basically the customer, the user, should be free to use any service, features, and deployment model that fits their need without being blocked by data portability, interoperability, or unfair contractual license terms, as we see on the marketplace currently. In terms of recommended measure to address this aspect of digital sovereignty, the use of portability standards and industry codes, the promotion of fair software licensing terms is absolutely critical. And some of these aspects are currently, as we speak, being debated as part of the Digital Market Act, the DMA legislation, which is before lawmakers in Europe. So that was for the first element. The second element is about the control of personal data. The GDPR was mentioned earlier. I think it's also worth mentioning the recent European Court of Justice decision in the Facebook case, the Schrems II ruling. This also has, let's say, created a lot of uncertainty on international data transfer and how this transfer can support, supply chain and the provision of services across countries and region. And here, the response that we are promoting is a comprehensive implementation of the GDPR, together with the use of industry code of conduct, like the one developed by CISPE and his company. So this is one aspect to address. The third aspect on security and resilience is based on the principle that customers should be able to ensure that the cloud providers can demonstrate compliance with the best state-of-the-art cloud security or data security standards. And this here might include multi-level security assurance as developed currently by the European Network Security Agency, ENISA, and also by Gaia-X, of which you mentioned I'm a member of the board. This involves normally different level of security assurance, with probably the highest level applied to highly sensitive data, requiring some mandatory storage and processing of the data. And this indeed should be a prerogative of the government under the relevant GATS exceptions for data localization. The fourth item, which builds into the security and resilience, is the protection of legal interests and jurisdictional immunity. So in that case, customer, user of a cloud and data infrastructure must be protected and shielded against, first they must be able to protect their intellectual property and also be shielded against the enforcement access that by third countries' law enforcement authorities that could be directed at their information and data. And here, this is the most debated and interesting issue in Europe, is as part of the deployments of the security assurance level, the requirement of a local processing / storage of data, of highly sensitive data, is also being considered as a way to shield customers' data, organization, private or public data, from unlawful or undesired access by third countries' authorities. I mean, the discussion here has been very, very much live with the annulment of the safe harbor between the US and the EU. All the data transfer are still taking place. The supply chain must function, but it's all happening in a legal vacuum, to use a nice word, and we still have no clarity and legal predictivity on how this transfer can be, let's say, accompanied by the proper legislation or international treaty. So this is the fourth, and the last but not least, this does not have obvious link with sovereignty or data sovereignty, but when you rely on the infrastructure of companies in countries who do not follow strict climate neutrality requirements, do not apply this or pursue these goals of climate neutrality, then it creates a competitive disadvantage for domestic providers. And this is a reason why CISPE and its members, they put forward sustainability and having climate neutral data centers and data infrastructure by 2030 as I would say a feature of data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty. So this is my fifth and last aspect, and for that many companies have already adopted commitments to make their data center and cloud infrastructure climate neutral by 2030, and CISPE has been leading the work on this with the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, which was adopted in January. So voilà, with this, I'll stop my my intervention. I'm happy to, we have developed over time cooperation and awareness raising activities with organizations in outside of Europe, more recently with South Africa and Israel, where we use let's say the best practices that we have been developing or participating into in Europe, and we share this this information with business leaders, other competing providers in other countries. So I'm happy to explore this if it's of any interest in the Singapore context and Asian context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco. So we've got a number of questions here, and I will start with the last one, which is partly my question as well. So this is an evolving issue. I know you don't have crystal balls, but if you look at the question is about China. What do panelists think about China's application to join DIPA? Does this signal a greater willingness by China to voluntarily pool its data sovereignty, or will China continue to tighten its control over cross-border data flows? My question, and it refers to that question as well, is, this is a fluid situation. So what do you think? Will we see the three types of sovereignty, data sovereignty, keep firm, right, to their definitions, or will there be shifts over time in that, China might, as Henry alludes to in his paper, might become more like the US? And I'm also interested in whether in Europe, whether the so-called restrictions actually impede innovation. Okay. Who wants to answer I'll throw it to Deborah first.
Thanks. I saw Susan unmuted, so I thought, oh, she was going to take this one.
Susan,
You know,
go
on
ahead.
a crystal ball, I don't know that we have a crystal ball, but I think this is the question of concern now for many policymakers, especially those who are, as the original question noted, those 3 countries who are part of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreements, so Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, are current members of DEPA, and China has asked to join this week. And I just learned today that Korea actually asked 2 weeks ago to join. So we have new members who have formally applied to join DEPA. Now that is a challenge because DEPA has different kinds of provisions, and we can argue about whether they're particularly binding or not. There is a variety of different kinds of commitments in there. But the point is, the original intention of DEPA, let me rephrase that. The original intention of DEPA was to say, let's have some consistency in policies. And even if you don't sign on to the whole DEPA package, we could use pieces of it in similar ways. And the idea is to reduce the risk of regulatory fragmentation in the digital space. That was the point of DEPA. Now you've got new members who want to come in. Part of you says, fantastic, that's part of what we were trying to accomplish, reduce inconsistencies. However, you need to make sure that the new members who are coming in have similar views about the kinds of appropriate and inappropriate regulatory policies that should be in place to govern the digital space. And the question that will be asked, and increasingly asked very loudly, is the Chinese view of appropriate digital regulations consistent or inconsistent with both DEPA, which is the new one for this week, and CPTPP, which was the question from 2 weeks ago. So we have 2 separate things that China has asked to join that have digital policy rules and implications. And the question is whether China agrees with that general perspective. And if it does, I suppose fine, but what does that mean for domestic policy that looks like it's going in a different direction? And if it doesn't agree, then what? Does that mean that you let them in and you hope that it changes over time? Or does that mean that you have to say, no, you're not allowed in because you have a very different regulatory approach? That is the giant question that now has been tossed into these discussions for especially some key members who are in both parties. And also sort of the larger question, do you need to have separate regimes or can they harmonize in some way or not? And I think we don't really have an answer at the moment, but I can promise you that there's a lot of policymakers who are now awake at night, just sweating, going, okay, now I have to solve a problem that I was hoping someone else would fix.
What do you think, Henry?
Well, I got asked this question a lot, especially after China speak to the CPTPP and now the DEPA. But I, would go against the grain and argue that actually China's application doesn't really a lot of changing its policy, because first of all, I mean, if you look at the CPTPP, for example, CPTPP Chapter 14 on e-commerce is provision of free flow data. Explicitly states that this is guaranteed only when the activities for the conduct of a business of a covered person. So what that means in plain terms is that unless you make a commitment on a specific sector, you are not required, even under the CPTPP, to provide free flow of data. So in other words, there's a right to free flow data, and the CPTPP, you are only required to allow free flow data for the sectors that you agree to open. So China, for example, the most problematic area would be online information services, since like what Google does. So they can choose not to open up the sector at all, and that would be perfectly legal under the CPTPP. Now, turning to DEPA, if you look at Annex 14 A and Annex 1, which are interesting, very interesting provisions. People have been seeing that well, these all these provisions guarantee free data, and I tell them you should read more carefully, because according to these two annexes, one annex says the parties understand that the provisions on free data doesn't create any actually rights or obligations between the parties, and then the other annex states that the dispute settlement system will not apply to the provision on the free data and also provision on data localization requirements, which again means that these two provisions are not going to be enforced even under the DIPA. So I don't really see any problem for China joining even under China's current system. And also, I mean, there are all these exception provisions China can resort to if under both agreements.
Susan?
Yeah, I see this rather differently. I see this as signaling on the part of China. And on one hand, it's a hopeful sign, right? But remember, CPTPP is a trade agreement. DIPA is an attempt to create something new based on modules. And it also focuses much more on the notion of trust and the idea that we should try to find common ground on regulatory coherence, not harmonization, but coherence, because it's going to be very difficult. The digital economy agreement of Australia and Singapore, I think, takes this even further. Now, obviously, China has not applied to join that agreement, but I think it's important to say that that one really tries to build a common approach to regulation, which I think is the next step in these agreements. So I would say I think even DIPA is a bit outdated in terms of where these agreements are going. But the question focused on why is China trying to move these into these agreements? And I think that is really, really important. No one knows unless they have conversations with senior Chinese officials, but it does seem to me that they are trying to signal that they get that the free flow of information is important, and they also get that they can do whatever they want with the exceptions, because that allows you a wide berth. So until regulatory coherence has meaning, they can apply to join all these agreements, but ultimately it doesn't discipline their behavior. And what I mean by that is censorship.
There's a question here. I'm not fully understanding, but I think it says, how can governments help citizens maintain control over their data? I assume that's what's happening already in the countries where there's control over data.
Does the questioner mean control over their data when it's held by the private sector or when it's held by the public sector, or both? There is a difference.
Yeah. Well, let me ask the question that I posed before. Do you think, Francisco, do you see in Europe innovation being constrained by the regulations?
Very broad question. I don't see that happening in Europe. I see thriving innovation in many different sectors, including in the cloud and infrastructure and data related sectors. The regulations are, in fact, especially, for example, the Digital Market Act, they're trying to approach in an ex ante manner the behavior of certain very big players who can exert very deep influence on many different market segments, in the digital economy. They are trying to prevent ex ante certain, let's say, bad behaviors, which could indeed affect innovation, affect the ability of the constant stability of digital market. So this is something that the regulators in Europe are very much aware. And similar to the GDPR, I think what I see happening in Europe, there's there is an innovative approach to these questions of what hinders, what supports innovation and competition. And with the DMA, they are trying to repeat what the GDPR brought to data protection, but more in the context of fair competition in an environment or an ecosystem where a handful of players have a tremendous influence. I'm thinking of the GAFAM, which is or the FANG, as you say. So this is something that the regulators are very aware of and trying to preempt or avoid in Europe. But I don't think that the current level of regulation are hindering innovation. At the contrary, I think they are using regulation to avoid that players exert excessive influence and impose self-preferential rules that benefit them, but not the other competitors in the ecosystem.
Do you have a response, Susan?
No, I thought he explained it very, very well.
But you're concerned about the generativity of data?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for making that point. But I agree with Francisco. There is mixed evidence as to whether or not, for example, GDPR, or again, there's no legislation right now that facilitates Gaia X, but the notion that, yes, the EU uses the exceptions to justify its approach to personal data protection, which some have argued squelches innovation. But I think the jury's still out on that. I just think the United States and China have had a heads up. The United States, because it's the nation's, I used the word from the wrong phrase, have had an early start, right? The United States, because it invented the internet and had the first firms. China, to a great extent, because it has a very strong internet engineering culture and a large population of available data. So it has economies of scale and scope and data. The EU will catch up because it has large numbers of middle-class consumers that actually actively provide their data, and lots of firms that are well evolved in these areas. But again, related to AI, the United States and China have had a head up, and it looks the same as for VR.
I'm going to give the last word to Debbie. What do you think?
Okay.
Do you think,
Well, I would just say that this discussion about competition is why our next paper, just to flag our next paper, is precisely on competition policy. Because if you look at the data sovereignty or digital sovereignty arguments, and it's about control, then government response will be, how do I exercise that control? And what tools do I have available to me in the government that will allow me to exercise the kind of control, the kind of regulatory control that I think is necessary? And increasingly, government officials, especially in Asia, are saying, let's use our existing competition rules in order for us to crack down on monopoly behavior and to build a more competitive environment. And so this next paper, which will also be somewhat unsatisfying, I'm going to just warn you heads up, because I don't have a solution to this. I still don't have a solution to this, but I can tell you some of the challenges around saying, let's use competition policy, developed originally to break up, a piece of irony in my view, an oil company, that's where it came from, was, that those kinds of rules about anti-monopoly power may or may not be appropriate for the digital space. Because you have to think about what does that mean, and a monopoly in digital may be different from a monopoly in the non-digital space. And then what does that mean for competition rules? So I think this is a really interesting and evolving area that is worth investigating more carefully. And we have to remember, we are often, let me rephrase that. We're often focused on a handful of firms, especially big American ones, but there are some powerful firms that are not American. And there are lots of firms, if we take market segments, that are actually in the digital space quite powerful in their segment of the larger digital economy. And so thinking about what does competition policy do for all of those different kinds of firms, different locations, different market segments, I think is interesting and results in some new challenges, actually, especially new regulatory challenges that are ahead. So again, trying to flag this as an issue of concern. What we do with that, how we solve that, I think is still an open question, but it's definitely something that matters.
We're over time, but since we, Francisco had wanted to talk about control, and let me give him the last word, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I didn't necessarily.
We're over time, but it's late anyway. It's 9:31 p.m.
I just wanted to bounce back on. Sorry, I wanted to bounce back on what Deborah was saying, and I'll be happy to share a bit of information with you on what the DMA is attempting to do in Europe, because basically we are trying to reinvent competition law, because in the digital market, if you have a competition issue with somebody dominant on a market segment, gatekeeper or not, if you follow the traditional route, you have to have ahead of you 6 to 8 years to get a result, and even by that time, your competitor might have circumvent whatever decision comes down the courts. That's a realization that has been very strong in Europe. And this is why they're trying to approach this new competition approach to digital market in an ex-ante manner, where you say behavior A, B, C, D. If you are a very large firm, if you have a dominant market in certain segments, this is prohibited. You can just not do it. So you don't need to have a long and lengthy fact finding. You can immediately almost right away say stop. Can't do this. You get a fine. If you continue, you can be they can break you up as a firm. So this is the new measure that are being invented as a supplement to traditional case-by-case competition law approach. And in a digital environment, many of the companies I work with, they cannot wait 5 years to get resolution on an issue. By that time, their market share is evaporated, and whatever is left is not enough to make them sustainable. So this is a completely new paradigm, and I'm happy to entertain this offline with you.
Okay, well, we have run out of time. We ran out of time about 3 minutes ago. But thank you all for the discussion. I have no more clarity about the issue than before. But it's not because of you, because I think it is an evolving issue that's very complex. Thank you again to all the speakers and to our audience for participating. I just want to remind you that the recording of the webinar will be available on our website next week. Let me invite everyone to join, to check out our website, www.heinrichfoundation.com. Let me wish you a wonderful day and evening ahead. Thank you again. See you next time.
Thank you, Dini.
Thank you.